Thank you very much for being here tonight. This is the Brussels launch of the Global Terrorism Index 2017, one of the most important events in the field of global politics and terrorism studies. We are pleased to host a number of very important speakers talking on this topic. This was originally organized as one of our EPSS guest lecture series. The EPSS is a program that we have here at Vesalius for undergraduate students in which they take a number of classes, all with a focus on European security from a European perspective. We had already two guest lectures this semester with Professor Kannert from the Institute for European Studies at VUEB and Ludovico Carlino, who is senior analyst in Middle East and North Africa at IHS Janes Market in London. We will have two more events in the coming 2 weeks with a focus on human rights in human times and a specific lecture on Belgian foreign fighters. Today instead we have not just one lecture, but we have a number of interventions. We will have an academic keynote speech from Professor Daniela Herrera, who is Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Catania and one of the leading experts in the field of terrorist study. I also have here her latest publication, which is the Palgrave Handbook of Global Counterterrorism Policy. She is also the president of the European Peace Research Association, and she will be focusing in her speech on the linkage between terrorism and organized crime and criminal activities. Then, to follow, we will have Professor Strobas, who is the Brussels representative of the Institute for Peace and Economics, the institute which has created the Global Terrorism Index. And Professor Strobas is also a professor here at Vesalius College, teaching NATO and transatlantic security. And after his introduction, we will have Ms. Ramona Manescu, who is an MEP with the European Popular Party and is the the deputy chair of the delegation for the relations with the Mashrek, and if I'm not wrong, also part of the delegation for the Gulf Peninsula, and a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And last but absolutely not least, we have Daniel Hislop, the research director of the Institute for Peace and Economics, talking more in depth about the Global Terrorism Index. Afterwards, we will have the question and answer session in which our speakers will interact with the audience, and once we finish, we have a reception here at the premises of Vesalius. So, I will leave the floor to Professor Herrera now. Thank you everyone for being here, and I hope you will enjoy this very important event.
Anyway,
thank you very much.
And I would like to thank Professor Cristiani for inviting me, and to the Vesalius College staff and people for having me and giving me this great chance to talk about the GTI and also to talk about my own research and this very important event and launch of this very important and essential document. Well, as Professor Cristiani said, I work in Catania, I teach international relations, and my basic interests have been on the role of non-state actors in international politics. So I started studying organized crime. I easily came to the connections with organized crime, with terrorism. So I started to analyze these connections and to work on the so-called crime-terror nexus, and I will tell you in a minute what I mean when I also say that these connections should be re-operationalized in order to be a bit more practical and more functional to policy prescriptions. So basically what I would do today is to talk about some more research trends on this specific topic, and also to say a few things about practical potential implications based on what has already been written in the GTI and the long-time perspectives which are launched in this important document. And also, I would like to say this, I'm very honored of the fact that I'm the president of this association, because this association is really important for not because of myself, of course, but because of the importance of peace studies, with anything related to the study of security threats, including terrorism, organized crime, insurgency, civil conflicts, are related to peace. So the more we work on security and we strengthen security, the more we have the chance to develop peace. Peace studies are absolutely important, and I'm very, very honored to have this chance to talk also on behalf of this association. So basically, this is what I will do. I will try to speak not too much, not to bore you so much, but I will basically split my presentation into three main parts. So I will highlight the major research trends briefly, in order to make an overview on the research and analysis in the crime terror field. Then I will go through some empirical considerations. Of course, the GTI in past issues have been relevant for my research as well, so I will also provide data which are part of my own research, which are related to past events. So it's nice to have an overview of the past events and the overview of current year as the GTI provides. And then to try to link these considerations to the impact they have on cooperation among states and between states, international organizations, and the impact they have also on counter-terrorism, on countermeasures, on policies, and also the use of scenarios which we are familiar with. So basically I will start with the classical theories on the crime terror nexus. This is the way through which this relationship has been depicted by the criminologists. I would say this topic has not been at the core of international relations studies, but mostly analyzed by criminologists. And even though I just use the word nexus in order to express better the relationship between two actors which are absolutely different, and they have different nature, different activities, different approaches, of course, because they are focusing on different markets in a way. But at the same time, the way through which these two actors, which are rational, absolutely rational, and free from political constraints, have been able to cooperate when it is necessary or when it is possible, have been at the core of this first investigation. So this graphical representation of the nexus is interesting because Tamara Makarenko was the first one to talk about the nexus, and other scholars, including here Picarelli, they worked on the strategic alliances, saying that these two actors are very different, but they can build alliances which are very strategical. And so as you can see in the graphical representation, these two different actors can start having interactions, alliances, and these alliances can strengthen, can be deeper, and they can develop in something which is more than a simple alliance and can bring to convergence and to the hybrid conditions in which the two actors lose their own identity and they change their own identity and they become something else. Criminal organizations and terrorist groups may change their own identity in the worst cases, let's say. But in analyzing these first investigations, within these first investigations, I focused on the two main issues which are related to the nexus. So the first of all, the fact that more than the strategic alliances, on the implication that these alliances can produce on security. So basically the use of terror tactics by organized crime groups, not so frequent, but they can happen. It can be useful sometimes for organized crime to use such tactics. And most frequent, of course, trafficking and smuggling as a source of funding to terrorists. As the GTI says that there are at least 4 terrorist revenue sources, and one of them is trafficking, of course, together with other important sources like donations, money transfers, taxation and extortion, but basically trafficking is one of the sources as well. So focusing on these two main aspects, which are apparently quite simple, we can also try to rationalize a little bit these nexus and these connections in order to see how they have an impact on security. So basically, I try to apply the most recent research trends coming from international relations and security studies. So I will briefly talk a little bit about each one. So the first of all, theory about the hybrid security, the hybridity of security threats. And secondly, the transboundary crisis, dimensions of crisis, or different dimensions which crisis, like terrorism, can be placed or can be considered as well. These dimensions can have multiple effects. And thirdly, research about radicalization. And of course, I will focus more on the first two research trends because I'm much more closer to them. But it is worth also mentioning the radicalization research because it is also becoming very, very important, especially in Europe. And I will also focus on the on how these analyses have investigated implications on policies and, of course, implications on cooperations, because it is also having an impact on states and on relations among different states. Of course, my focus is on Europe and on European Union, but I also consider the global dimension, which is also very relevant as for this specific topic. As for the first one, what it is very important to consider is what is the hybrid, what is the hybridity, what is the meaning of such word which for the first time is used in a very deep way into security. And I'm quoting the European Parliament. The European Parliament was very interested in the past in studying also the crime terror nexus, and also they asked a panel of experts to produce a report. And the same happened with hybrid security, hybrid threats. So this is basically the definition which is given by the European Parliament. And what is important, I only strive, of course, it was a long document, I only focus on three main things. I mean, the interconnected nature of challenges, so the nature, so first of all, the first key word we have to consider, and then the actors which are involved, which are now multiple, and of course, as a sort of consequence, the multiple forms which tools which are needed to tackle such threats are required, of course. So this means that everything is multiple, everything is much more complicated. And just to give you an idea of how this multiple set of things can work, I give you some examples. So the first one was a definition given by the European Parliament. If we try to apply this concept of hybrid threats to the current threats we have, or the current threats we are usually calling as our threats affecting our daily life, we see that, of course, they are a challenge for the state, first of all. They are a challenge for non-state actors, of course. So they are a challenge because there are a multiplicity of non-state actors which have very, very different natures. So if just a few examples, Hamas, Hezbollah, which are of terrorist organizations or political parties, it depends on the perspective, the political use of some of the label. And at the same time, even though let's say the classical security threats which are associated to hard security are now having a multiple nature. So there is the of terrorism, cyber security, cybercrime, organized crime, also piracy, which is something which is sometimes left aside, but which is still quite relevant. And now it comes to labels like crime terror nexus or crime terror insurgency nexus. That is to say that it's very hard to separate them because they can have different interaction. And this is the point, not necessarily these interactions are alliances. Sometimes they are just occasional ones. But let's go to the second trend, research trend, which is transboundary crisis. And I refer here to the fact that usually a crisis affects multiple dimensions. So there are no more boundaries in the sectors which can be affected by implications of a crisis. So there are multiple sectors which are affected. So the more complex the boundary constellation in a particular case is, the harder it is to manage such crises, these crises are usually marked by the urgency to do something, and then secondly, the uncertainty. We are not sure how to manage most of the times, and it happens with all our current threats we are unfortunately now familiar with. So when we talk about terrorism, so the crime-terror nexus is perceived as a crime, as a transboundary crisis, because when we talk to Europeans, people, normal people, daily life of Europeans, is affected by criminals and terrorists because it is a sort of bothering effect on normal life. And what people need is to very quickly restore the normalcy of their life. So basically a transboundary crisis is something which is urgent, which is uncertain, but something which requires to politicians or to political elites to do immediately something to restore the normalcy, and also to use such measures which have been used as a constant, not let's say temporary solution, but something which can be used again in other crises, something which can be used and applied every time it is necessary. So as you can see, from the point of view of the threats, from the point of view of responses to threats, we are now living and working in an environment which is very complicated, without normal boundaries and without labels, I would say. It's very hard now to clearly put boundaries in all these things. And if we also try to analyze from a scholar point of view, I mean, from a research point of view, this is, of course, you can immediately see that it is not just theories, but there are enormous political implications. As for radicalization, as I was telling you before, I won't spend too much time in it because it is not my specific focus, but the interest in radicalization is increasing a lot. And well, scholars are more focused on these two main features. So the root causes, why people radicalize, why apparently normal people decide to radicalize. In the GTI there's a very interesting part on these are the foreign fighters as well, and the pathways, why and how people radicalize, which are the main reasons for that. People apparently living normal life should start a process which brings towards something which is destructive. And in parallel, there are also analyses about of course, the opposite, the de-radicalization, how it is possible for states, for institutions, for the welfare state, first of all. I mean, institutions which are expected to be stable, to have the tools for tackle such problems, to de-radicalize people who are radicalizing. And secondly, rehabilitation. Especially during my research in Asia, I found that there are many scholars working there which are deeply involved, also practically, in the investigations on the rehabilitation, which is also related to state programs. So rehabilitation, that is to say, when people are already committed some crimes, people who are already being part of terrorist organizations, but can anyway be rehabilitated because it is possible. So these research are very, very important because they are also being relevant for in terms of policy prescriptions. And as for our purposes, for us as Europeans, we are much more concerned about foreign fighters. Once again, I don't spend too much time on this. Also, the GTI is very clearly talking about, also in quantitative terms, about the foreign fighters. I only quote One of the leading scholars on this specific topic is Becker, based in Leiden University, and is here quoted with a collective work, and he provides a potential definition of foreign fighters, also saying that it is absolutely very difficult to make research on foreign fighters because we can have estimation of them. We can have estimation of their own activities and the reasons why they went to Syria and then they come back. And so just to explain, just to give you more clarification on how and why it's so difficult, it says that the same scholars are saying this would require knowledge of all these things, which as you can imagine are very, very difficult. So the actual presence in Syria, the reasons why they are going to Syria, the type of activities they did there, and the kind of activities they've been involved in, the reasons for returning, and also we cannot say that people simply traveling to Syria are doing something, or people transiting in Istanbul, for example. So, and it is also a very sensitive issue, gathering data about foreign fighters, because it also affects the freedom of movement of European citizens, and we are very proud of this, and it's fine that we should be proud of this important achievement, but of course this is a dilemma between the need to strengthen security, but at the same time the need to protect to strengthen our security by gathering data on people who are suspected. And again, it's a very sensitive issue, so this is why it's so difficult. But still, in terms of perceptions of risks and perception of insecurity, this is a big problem for Europeans. When it comes to empirical consideration, I talk about something which is clearly stated and described in the GTI. So when we talk about the crime-terror nexus and about the implications on security, on regional security, on global security, the first thing we would like to know is how much is this impact? How can we quantify the impact? As scholars, of course, this is our first concern, but I think it is something everybody would like to know. How can we measure the impact? And of course, we try to focus on how the conflicts have an impact. I mean, how likely is that these connections can be developed when there is a conflict? The impact of political instability. So, for example, we are now so concerned about what is happening in Zimbabwe. Because nobody can know or can guess about the follow-up of these events. And this is an additional political instability. And this political instability, together with economic instability, or in the worst case, deprivation, together all these conditions can offer that gray zone in which the state is so inefficient, is so, by quoting Susan Strange, the state retreats because it's no more able to do something. If there is a retreat of state, other actors can fill that vacuum. So we can say that in these conditions can facilitate the rise of connections between criminals and terrorism, and sometimes also between terrorism, criminals, and insurgents. But also, I would like to say other things after data. It is true that these conditions are facilitating the rise of these threats, but unfortunately, this is not just only a problem associated to non-democratic regimes or unstable political conditions. Unfortunately, the nexus or the implications of nexus are also compatible with democracy, and that's it's not a good news, of course, for us. So I'm just showing with you some data because I'm working on a book project on the nexus. So of course I'm going to refresh data, but since I saw that in the report, the GTI is expressing investigating the results of data about the current year, I'm using here the past year. So what I'm trying to do is to use the data about terrorism by using GTD, the Global Terrorism Database, And I'm also using data about conflicts in the next slide, which are taken by the database of Peace Research Institute in Norway, and try to see how related are these data. And I'm considering a very long slot of time. I mean, I'm considering everything starting in 1989, because at the end of the Cold War, something changed in the relations among states, and also in the nature of conflicts and in the nature of global trends, until this research is expected to arrive until today, of course. But this is just until 2011. And these are the number of terrorist attacks per region. And secondly, I've considered the terrorist attacks and armed conflict per region again. And it is interesting, I wanted to focus on the past, 2011 and 2012, because, and what it is coming out from the GTI is that there is a reduction of deaths by terrorism in some countries which were very, very affected in the past, like Nigeria, for example, which is also linked to the failure, in a way, of organizations like Boko Haram, and while Iraq, unfortunately, continued to have the largest increase. But at the same time, in the GTI also say some other important things. The fact that there's a deterioration, a regional deterioration, 8 out of 9 regions. So if you try to see this data with qualitative data, and I built this chart considering data provided by UNODC, so data, reliable data, of course, on the presence of the different kinds of threats, presence of terrorist groups, and presence of organized crime groups, and try to consider how all these things and interactions among all these actors involve different regions. We see that, of course, there's a deterioration in almost all regions. Well, it is true that I'm considering different kinds of regions, I mean, compared to the GTI. So probably I'm going to change my list of regions according to the GTI, which appears more rational to me, but it was just for an article I've written in the past, and it's part of my own investigation. But it was important for me to understand from a quantitative and qualitative point of view how these different actors were interacting and producing implications on security in different regions. So you see that also Europe, Southeast Europe, of course, while in the GTI, Europe is, as a region is considered and is number 4. There's a deterioration of MENA region, for example, unfortunately, but Europe is number 4, which is not very good at all, not good news at all, after South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is not very good, but this means also another important thing. This means that we cannot only associate this kind of threats to lack of democracy or the lack of political stability. Those conditions can facilitate for sure, but they are not the only ones. So and also use these 3 categories, which I have also found in the GTI. I prefer to forget about the nexus, which is a little bit too rigid term, and to use these three labels, which are, let's say, 3 big categories in which we can say there are different nuances, different intermediate kind of interaction. So this is just to say that criminals and terrorists can interact and can have alliances sometimes. They can cooperate, but they can also establish temporary alliances, ad hoc alliances, which can be functional in one period and then they can stop. Or they can simply coexist because they are placed in a region or in an area or in a strategic corridor, which is used for some strategic purposes. So this is not just a problem of alliances, it is also a problem of interactions among the 2 actors, or the reciprocal use of tactics by the 2 when it is necessary or when it is useful. And so basically, in terms of policy prescriptions or in terms of consequences for politics, we can say that these kind of interactions are a threat to national political system. They are a threat because they are a problem to legitimacy and efficiency of institutions. So when institutions work, they can provide goods, responses to citizens. That's basic, but this is how things work. So of course they can be associated to state failure, they can be associated to political instability. This facilitates a lot, but unfortunately there are evidences, and also the GTI demonstrates that there are, of course, their compatibility with democracy, so they can also be a challenge to democracy, as it is clear from what is happening in Europe, and they can also adapt to regional variations. So depending on different regions, these interactions can be quite different, but I'm afraid can be also very productive. So because if we have a look at data in different regions, and as we see in the deterioration of different regions, we see that unfortunately this kind of threat can adapt to different conditions. So at the end, we cannot use specific labels, so we need to use a different set of labels to include and understand a very multi-layered set of interaction and a very multi-layered reality. And going to the end, I refer now, when it comes to policy, prescription, generally speaking, it is very common to use scenarios. I mean, I refer to experts, to real experts on terrorism, not myself, of course, but people who are really able to have those tools which are necessary to understand what is important and useful to do. When we refer to scenarios, we usually refer to those big categories, extreme categories, which are used for or identified for tackling these threats. So we go for the law enforcement option, which is very, very strategic and very practical, but also to the military option sometimes, the military interventions. So I refer, for example, the missions deployed by the EU for policing the borders, or for teaching to lawyers and police officers to how to manage the crisis. And then we also have the multilateralism, which means strengthening cooperation. So there are many states in the world which have very good expertise in fighting against terrorism. So the multilateralism means also having common definitions, common tools, common records also would be nice. And the last one, the worst one, is fencing, closing the borders, protect ourselves, because we prefer to put the threats outside, but we know very well this is an option which is always on the table, but we know very well that it cannot work. It cannot work because everything is a transboundary, and we cannot simply put a boundary to something which is in itself transboundary. Finally, what we can say, of course, is not conclusions possible to do. I mean, there are only preliminary conclusions, only preliminary facts that I can say at the end. For sure, these connections between criminals and terrorism are growing, but they're also diversifying, so we cannot simply define in one way. They are unfortunately having different faces and different forms. For sure, this is a threat which produces implication on different set of security, on democratic and non-democratic regime. The impact on foreign fighters, especially for Europe, is very, very strong, and also perceived. The perception is quite strong, but again, it's not easy to research, not always easy to research. We can do it, of course, but we would need more kind of data. So basically, if I have to conclude with keywords, what we need to strengthen is, first of all, and the GTI is a very, very good example, we need to strengthen, first of all, knowledge and awareness. We have to know the threats we are fighting against, and then in order to shape capabilities we have, not just in terms of things that we would like to know or to do, but things which are really needed. And finally, to be really engaged in different kinds of cooperation. If we're not able, as states, we are not able or willing to cooperate so much, we at least need to establish some forms of cooperation which can be flexible, which can be able to shape to the situation, to the conditions, but which is absolutely necessary. And I leave it here. Thank you.
So everybody can hear me? I think that's pretty clear. I don't need the microphone. Oh yeah, this one maybe. Thank you. Can I just give you back the microphone? Thank you very much. So Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, students and friends, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here at Vesalius College again for my part for the launch of the 5th edition of the Global Terrorism Index. And it's really heartwarming to see so many familiar faces, not only the students but also the other persons that are here tonight, and to feel your permanent support. Thank you also to you, Professor Riera, for an excellent presentation on this dual topic of terrorism and organized crime, and also for being such a good promoter of the Global Terrorism Index and creating out of the index an academic source and an academic reference. Thank you very much. Thank you also for the unity in effort of the different partners who decided to support tonight's presentation and launch of the Global Terrorism Index 2017 here in Brussels. I'm talking about the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Europe, about the European Popular Party Group at the European Parliament, the Atlantic Treaty Associations, and of course, last but not least, our hosts of Vesalius College and the Global Governance Institutes. It has been now a little bit more than 3 years that the Institute for Economics and Peace has been active in the Brussels bubble. In these 3 years, we have been able to promote both the Global Peace Index, which is released every year in June, and the Global Terrorist Index, which is of course released every year in November, as well as many more other publications and research. Our analysis and indices are now used as a reference and as support document by decision and policymakers at all levels of responsibility within both major international institutions located here in Brussels, NATO and the EU. Last year, Dr. Juliet Byrd, in charge of counterterrorism at NATO headquarters, provided the keynote address. This year, Mrs. Ramona Monescu, member of the European Parliament for the EPP, will provide her remarks tonight just after my short introduction. For your information, as an answer to an invitation provided by the Estonian presidency of the EU, the Institute for Economics and Peace will be represented by its director Kamila Skippa on December 6th. The Institute for Economics and Peace is going to present the GTI at the level of the COTER, which is the counter-terrorism coordination body of the EU Council. This success is to be granted not only to the high quality of the product, but most importantly to the intense work of a terrific team at the Institute for Economics and Peace back in Sydney, Australia, under the leadership of our founder and executive chairman, Steve Killelea. Yesterday, during our social media campaign at the occasion of the worldwide release of the 2017 GTI, somebody commented on Twitter about the 80% drop of the impact of terrorism in Nigeria. And he claimed that the youngest child could have come to this obvious conclusion. I told him he was right. Everybody is able to develop a perception and everybody is able to develop an opinion. But it's a whole other thing when inputs like those from the 2017 GTI help to transform these opinions and help to transform these perceptions into knowledge based on facts, figures, allowing us to identify and differentiate causes and consequences, to define trends and tendencies. Those are in fact two very different worlds. So enough talking from my side, especially for the students who already had to enjoy me for a couple of hours this afternoon. Thank you again for being with us tonight and for being major supporters, promoters and consumers of IEP's work on a daily basis. So let me now introduce the two next speakers. First, Mrs. Manescu, who will deliver tonight's keynote speech, and my colleague at the Institute for Economics and Peace, Daniel Hislop, who currently on his European promotion tour for the GTI will present to you tonight the results of the 2017 GTI. So Mrs. Ramona Manescu, a member of the European Parliament, graduated in law, attended postgraduate studies at the Romanian Diplomatic Institute, and postgraduate studies in international relations and European integration. She has a certain amount of years of political experience, both at national and international level. She held the position of Deputy Secretary of State at the National Authority for Youth in Romania, and she was Minister of Transports in the Romanian government. At international level, she was the Vice President of the International Federation of Liberal Youth, and later of ALDE Party. Now, today, in her third mandate as member of the European Parliament, Ramona Manescu's main political focus is set on building a stronger, more coherent, clear and determined EU foreign policy in relation to the Middle East, North Africa and the wider question of Europe's response to jihadism. Mrs. Manescu, part of the EPP political group, is active in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, as well as in the International Trade and the Transport and Tourism Committees. She is acting Vice Chair of the Delegation for Relations with the Mashrek countries. Her activity in relation with the MENA region completes with a membership in the Delegation for Relations with the Arab Peninsula. She also chairs the Euro-Parliamentary Friendship Groups with Lebanon, and I've seen on LinkedIn, I think, that you have been very busy with this part of your job in the past days relating to the ongoing political crisis in Lebanon, and you also to Lebanon, to Oman and Qatar being the two other countries you relate to. And the second speaker for tonight, my colleague Daniel Islap. He has been working for the Institute for Economics and Peace since 2011. He leads and manages our research team and coordinates IAP's research and consulting activities. He has led the production of 6 years of the Global Peace Index report and several other research projects on drivers and trends in peace and conflict and on the economics of conflict. While at IAP he has worked as a consultant to the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, the Commonwealth Secretariat and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Most recently, he co-authored the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, 2016 States of Fragility Report, a guidance and policy document on addressing violence and fragility. He holds a Master's of Economics from Sydney Universities with first-class honors. I discovered this in your CV, Daniel. Very much impressed by this. So, Mrs. Manescu, thank you for having accepted my invitation to provide us tonight with your opening remarks. I truly appreciate your commitment in the field of peace and security at the European Parliament, and it is a pleasure to cooperate with you. I'm looking forward to the series of events you will organize on cyber terrorism, and thank you for involving the Institute for Economics and Peace in this initiative. Thank you also for rushing back from Strasbourg this afternoon after the last vote and arriving just in time at 6 o'clock. So enough from me, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think everybody will hear me well enough, so I don't need a micro. So, ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, students, I'm really happy to be here, and I must thank to the Institute for Economic and Peace and Serge Strobans for giving me the privilege of addressing you tonight on such a crucial issue. I think the very existence of a global terrorism index is in itself a sign of the times that we are living now. I wish I could stand here and sound upbeat and optimistic. Sadly, terrorism remains the greatest threat to security across Europe. And I know we are all grateful for the insights that we will have from the Institute for Economic and Peace, the initiator of this study, which completes the Global Peace Index. And I was listening very carefully and with a great interest what Professor Daniela Herrera had to say, as well Serge. And I'm looking forward to hear Daniel Hislop on his presentation on the Global Terrorism Index. These are troubling times. The refugee problem continues to present massive challenges to Europe, and we in the European Parliament, we still working on it, because this is not something that we already done with. Turkey's unpredictability and the prospects of further conflict in the Middle East are significant and unsettling. And yet, when Europeans are asked what worries them more, terrorism comes first. Fortunately for us all, this year has avoided another surge in terrorist atrocities, and the waves of refugees across our borders has abated somewhat. And this, I think, and I like to think that, this was at least in part down to the long list of measures put in place by European Union, and Professor already mentioned some of it. But we cannot relax, and we are far from it, because stopping terrorists entering in European Union is just a short-term fix. The equivalent of putting sticky plasters on the deep wound. Ultimately, defeating terrorism means reverting to an idea that is not new, but that we must continue to repeat it like a mantra. We must address the deep roots of the terrorism. And I think you already touched that point. What are these roots? These causes of disillusionment and despair of the people in the region, poor health and educational system, we know that, lack of economic opportunities, especially for the young people, unemployment, poor infrastructures, conflict, and weak institutions. All this we saw in the regions that export terror and export refugees. And this is not a rocket science. This is what we are living every day. The Middle East has always had its problems, but they continue to deepen. And at their very heart, it's nowadays Syria. How much it will cost, and how much it costs the conflict in Syria? While many are asking how the war in Syria will end, it's vital to understand that the end, it's simply going to the beginning of or something equally challenging. How much will cost to rebuild the country? Because, okay, the cost that we are seeing today, we shall add to the cost that we are seeing today, we shall add the cost of rebuilding the country. The World Bank and United Nations estimate already 100 billion to repair what was destroyed, what has been destroyed, and with more needed to get Syria back on track. And that just for Syria. Let's not forget Iraq, let's not forget Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and all countries ravaged by the conflict, and each failing to address our well-worn roots of terror. These countries are either unable or unwilling to finance education and health system, to invest in infrastructure, to invest and develop industry, agriculture, so the economy, to democratize the country, or to fight corruption. The results that we all see are refugees and terrorists. Two trends that are clearly linked somehow, and in some points. In Europe, we are fortunate not to be dealing with the direct cost of war, as it happens in the region, but we are focused on the logistics and the cost of fighting terrorism, because we are investing a lot in this, starting with cost related to the refugees, the cost related to the refugees not only in European Union, but also in Jordania, in Lebanon, in Turkey, and elsewhere. And it was multiplied by the cost of counter-terrorist measures here in European Union, a growing military presence on the streets, and we all see, at least here in Brussels, improved security in and around buildings, airports and public spaces, better resourced bodies to tackle the threat, and here I'm talking also about the police officers allocated to different European bodies that are working on this, increased budget on these institutions, which is also a cost, or completely reorganized structure like the border and coast guard agencies. So the costs are huge, but our efforts are starting to pay off since we did see some improvements in the last year. The war against Daesh has benefited from the combination of legislative measures, institutional changes, and security presence on the field, integrated with the war effort in Syria and Iraq. This is what we see now. As a direct result of losing the territory on the field, Daesh has also lost the access to some funds, some resources, financing resources. Meanwhile, a coordinated intelligence effort across OECD countries has restricted the group's ability to plan and execute major terrorist attacks. But as we all know, terrorism does not die. It simply mutates, and its modus operandi adapts. And some of the newer threats are harder to be prevented. When Brussels was attacked, Daesh managed an expensive and complex combination of skilled followers, training, equipment, and explosives. When Barcelona suffered the attack on La Rambla, all that was required was a single individual and a rented car. These changes are just the start of a new wave of terror. To understand this wave, we must be clear that we are not just dealing with religious zealots, but with individuals who are all too familiar, as you also mentioned, with organized crime and the penitentiary system. They mix in circles prevalent in drugs, gun trafficking, robberies, extortions, and other activities that have nothing to do with religion in the end. In this environment, there are no limits and no taboos. If it generates money and influence, it is permitted. All is permitted in their minds. And each of these cancers spread ever faster across different groups and regions. Various experts and analysts have pointed out several new potential threats coming from the terrorist groups or individuals, and one of these new threats is the potential impact of homemade devices, drones loaded with explosives. Can be used in the attempt to take down an airplane. Can be here in Zaventem, on Charleroi, anywhere. Nicholas Rasmussen, the director of the US National Counterterrorist Center, described these threats simply and yet chillingly. 2 years ago, this was not a problem. A year ago, this was an emerging problem. And now it's a real problem. Hezbollah, for example, aided by Iran, has developed the most advanced drones capability of any terrorist group in the world in this moment. Another threat and vulnerability comes from potential cyber attacks conducted by terrorist groups. Daesh has online propaganda magazines. Rumiyah, which replaced Dabiq. Al-Qaeda has Inspire. These sites do not sit alone in cyberspace. They have a very real effect on what is happening on the streets of Europe. To this point, terrorist groups, particularly Daesh, have used the internet lately for long-distance communication, and we saw that on propaganda, on radicalization, on recruitment. But as our society becomes more and more connected, it also becomes more vulnerable, and the threat is there. Europol has reported 30,000 illegal sites related to terrorism, radical movements, jihadism, and so on. This is a massive online presence that in this moment, I can tell you, we are not yet able to defeat it. We are trying, but we are not there. Nothing reassures us that cyber groups belonging to terrorist organizations or connected with this will not use the internet as a weapon to disrupt nuclear power stations, dams, electricity grids, or air traffic control systems. All can be infiltrated online, unfortunately. So we are very, very vulnerable from this point of view. Islamist cyber groups exist. Many are backed by nation states, like Iran, and the intent on prey upon Europe's cyber vulnerability is explicit. This is a murky world where there are no clear boundaries. That's also the difficult part of fighting against. Terrorist groups like Daesh mix with cyber groups like AFAK, Electronic Foundation, or like the Hezbollah cyber group, which is loosely affiliated to nation states, organized criminal groups with terror links, and a wide range of unregulated hacktivists and militants like the famous Russian patriotic hackers. And this is a really deadly cocktail. We are now near being able to catch these groups. It is challenging enough simply to define them. Take the WannaCry attack source in North Korea. Was it carried out by a terrorist group, this one? Cyber criminals? Hacktivists? Today's cyber criminal can be tomorrow's cyber terrorist, unregulated and often uncatchable. That's a problem. And so we have the specific threat of terror in a rented car or a freely available drone. Then there is the murky world of online criminality whose potential is not yet fully understood. And finally, we have the potential impact of the unstable and volatile political situation in the Middle East and North Africa. And here is the slide of a chaos. It's a very funny one. It's made by a satirist. And that says everything, in fact. Syria and Iraq are still war zones. If normality ever returns, it will be many years from now. In Libya, a collapsed state has created power vacuums and a paradise for terrorist activities everywhere. Yemen is in the grips of a civil war and humanitarian crisis, probably one of the highest today. But this year threw us a new challenge, the Gulf crisis, dividing Qatar from the other GCC countries. This may be lower down the news agenda, but it continues despite many diplomatic efforts. And now we see a new catastrophe unfolding in Lebanon nowadays. Iran, backed by Russian energy interest, is pushing towards establishing a Shia corridor to the Mediterranean Sea, and that's what happened nowadays. This clashes head to head with Saudi interest, also present in the region and wanted to take control in at least one part. Lebanese territory provides the potential meeting ground, and I fear that a military conflict is looming threat. These conflicts each provide us with different tiers of challenges. The high-level strategic issues, the proxy wars being fought in the background, the economic and political turmoil that ensure, the cultural unraveling, the social appeal and personal tragedies, and the ever-growing potential for terrorism in the region that can so easily be imported in the European Union, as we saw lately. So what we can do in this situation? First and foremost, we can learn from our successes, like the passenger name record directive that we finally passed it last year in the European Parliament with a big fight, or the directive on the security of network and information system. And from our failures, because we do need to learn from our failures, not to repeat it. Take Abdelbaki Essati as an example. Probably you all heard about him. 44-year-old imam in Ripoll, Spain. Born in Morocco but living in Spain in 2002. He was convicted at that time of drug smuggling, and then in 2014 he was requested to be deported from Spain. But he claimed, through his lawyers, that this violated his human rights. So, a drug trafficker shouldn't be deported because his human rights will be violated. Okay. And he was allowed to remain. That's good. A successful asylum application in November 2014 allowed him to move freely across the Schengen area. Perfect. From where he masterminded the La Rambla terrorist attack in Barcelona, who succeeded. He died on 21st August, just before, in an accidental explosion while preparing a homemade TATP explosive. How beautiful is this? And this is about our failure. And this happens not once, many times in Europe. We cannot claim we didn't know about this man. Somebody must carry the responsibility, therefore. We can't keep on separating actions from repercussions, as we did in the past. When we use human rights to keep a drug trafficker in our union, we must not forget the risks. And we must not forget the rights of those who are potential victims. Not can we allow information and ideas to be stuck in silos. National intelligence agencies, police, judicial authorities, European agencies, and Europol cannot work in isolation, duplicating work. That happens several times, and guarding their own interests and informations. This cannot continue like that. We need better cooperation. We need coordination and communication among our institutions and agencies that are working on the field. And something about which I am very passionate about, we must also push much harder on criminalization of terrorism. Talking about this, I can tell you, I don't know if you can, okay, thank you. In today's world, we can't afford a dysfunctional United Nations Security Council, as we have it now, but this is exactly what we have. Let's take the example of Russia. Russia consistently vetoes the UN resolutions that could have been stopped the conflict in Syria, starting with the first resolution till today. It doesn't wish to solve the problem, but to steer it, while it pursues its own military and economic interest in the region. The result is not just a drawn-out conflict, but also a magnified threat for terrorism. This dysfunctionality it's away at the heart of the United Nations system. We still lack a legally binding definition of terrorism, and the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism is still being debated, and we are debating since 20 years already. So we are still debating on the common and comprehensive definition. I believe we can do so much more in this regard. There are so many countries and groups with the influence to defeat terror. This includes our traditional allies like US and NATO, with whom we must push much harder in the right direction. India, for example, is already there, having proposed this convention in 1996. And I believe China will follow, which leaves Russia, which forestalls and obscures well beyond its status. If we cannot circumvent Russia using the full power and influence of the United Nations, then what hope do we have making a real difference against the international surge of terror? I don't want to make any apologies for my lack of optimism tonight. We live in an era of unprecedented terror threats, and the cyber world which can grow faster than we can possibly respond to it. However, there are shafts of light. We understand the causes of terrorism, which is a start. we understand where our investment and focus should turn. That is the long play. In the short term, we are improving our knowledge and we are managing to put sticky plasters on the right places. But these fights cannot be fought alone, and the European Union can set an example and it can lead the way. But to fight a global threat, we need global buy-in. Until that point, I fear that the Institute for Economic and Peace admirable work will continue to bring us bad news from time to time, also for the years to come. So we need to do more in order to provide you with better results for your research. Thank you very much, and I do hope to have better news. Just contradict me.
Thank you so much, Dario, and thank you so much, Professor Herrera and Serge, and of course, Ramona Manesco for your introduction and comments. It's much appreciated. And of course, thank you everyone for coming along tonight. I think the first thing to sort of say is, why do we do this study? Why do we study terrorism, and why do we try and take a data-driven approach to terrorism? Well, if you think about what terrorism is fundamentally about, it's actually fundamentally about myth-making. It's about trying to accentuate the actual threat that it really poses, and that's what this report is really about fundamentally. It's about compiling the hard data to really show where terrorism occurs, who are the victims, and why does it occur. And I'm going to present a few more slides. I know it's getting a little bit late, but we'll try not to spend too much more time, and we can move to the Q&A. I'm not going to talk too much more about the Institute. Serge has done plenty of that and deeply embarrassed us all, so we're going to move on. I'm going to talk about the methodology very quickly, a little bit about the history of the index. It's the 5th year that we've compiled this particular report. It's a ranking of 163 countries in the world, and we're looking at the relative impact of terrorism. Originally, this project actually grew out of a larger research project, which is the Global Peace Index, which looks at broader societal peace. And one of the reasons why we wanted to further understand terrorism is because what we realized some 5 years ago is that terrorism is an incredibly fast-growing form of violence. As the world has become much less peaceful in the past 10 years, terrorism has been a really key part of that. And if we look at global peace, and Ramona touched on some of the trends, some of the very disturbing global trends that we've seen, the past 10 years has really seen a very large uptick in the number of conflicts and the number of internal conflicts within countries especially. And what we're really talking about is the explosion of a large number of non-state actors in a lot of fragile settings. And so the study of terrorism is highly relevant to the broader study of international peace. A little bit on methodology. I think it's important to point out and to highlight what the definition of terrorism actually is. What do we mean by terrorism? Very controversial thing. Ramona also explained the fact that the UN's been debating it for 20 years, still hasn't got an agreement. It's one of those topics that is very difficult to define. The definition that we use is perhaps the most widely accepted, which is any form of violence by a non-state actor that's motivated by a religious, ideological, political, economic goal. And it tends to have to be a form of violence outside the precepts of international humanitarian law. I'm not going to go through the nuts and bolts of the methodology. It's important to state that the Global Terrorism Database put together by the University of Staff is one of the important inputs to the index. We work very closely with them, and this work couldn't be possible without their work. The index that we compile allows us to do much more socio-economic analysis and to better understand terrorism trends and patterns. So this is the map for 2017. We're actually looking at terrorism in the 2016 year. So that's important to bear in mind when I'm running through the results. We're talking about terrorism really up to the end of 2016. Beginning in 2017 and to date, I will touch on some of those trends. I think it's not surprising to see where terrorism happens. We're fairly familiar with this. I think what's perhaps more notable is where terrorism does not happen. If you look at South America and Latin America, the terrorism is a far less common form of violence. They have other forms of violence, interpersonal violence. There's obviously other types of conflicts in other parts of the world. The other really critical point about terrorist activity, and I think what this report's been very successful to point out, is the fact that terrorism as a form of violence is highly concentrated. It's really being concentrated in 5 countries in the world: Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. And you can see that on the map here. I'm just going to step through some of the global findings, and excuse the very small font with PowerPoint is not cooperating this evening. But what the headline finding of the report this year is very much a positive one. If you look at the total number of global deaths from terrorism, it's improved by about 22% since the peak in 2014. So, good news. So, there's your good news. I mean, we do see, however, some slightly disturbing trends, and I will touch on those. If you look at what's happened in the OECD member countries, in Western Europe and the US, there's actually been an increase, and many of us in this room are very familiar with the reason for that. It's because of lone actor attacks in countries like Belgium, in the UK, in Germany and France, and other places in the region, in Europe. And what we saw in 2016 was the highest level of terrorist deaths since 1988, if you take out September 11. So 2016 was a disturbing year for terrorist activity in Western Europe. The main reason for the broader global trend, however, is the fact that Nigeria and Boko Haram, which, let's not forget, only 2 years ago was the most deadly group in the world, according to the terrorism database, has actually had the number of deaths that's committed fall by 80%. So big improvement there. A lot of the reason for that is because of cooperation and collaboration with Nigerian forces and other governments in the region, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and it's a very strong example of regional cooperation to defeat a terrorist group. I'm just going to very quickly touch on the top 10. Again, it's just to reaffirm the 75% concentration of terrorist deaths in those top 5 countries, or worst affected 5 countries, I should say. One notable thing about the top 10 or worst 10 affected this year is the fact that Turkey actually went from 14 to 9, and that was really due to a range of factors, but we have seen a very notable increase in Kurdish rebel PKK attacks in the country, as well as the presence of ISIL. A lot of the other countries on that list, in the bottom 5, Yemen, Somalia, India, Libya, they've actually seen improvements, but they're still in the 10 worst affected. The chart's not so clearly formatted, but what this shows is the trend over the last 17 years, and really you can see 2 major periods for terrorist activity. 2007, which was the US troop surge, where we saw a very large amount of terrorist activity in Iraq, and the beginning of 2013, when we saw ISI morph into Islamic State or ISIL or Daesh, and the very extensive amount of extreme violence that group carried out in the following years. As you can see, however, 2016, 2015, improvements in the level of terrorism, and I think what this actually reflects is that we are in a new phase in terrorist activity globally. The 2 major groups that have been the most deadly groups in the past 10 years, Boko Haram and ISIL, have been fundamentally militarily undermined or compromised in the places where they mostly operate. And I think that's a positive story. However, it does pose a lot of new risks and new challenges that we really aren't sure about. You can't see the countries on this, but this shows the largest decreases. The first one there is Nigeria. I touched on that. The other countries that improved, a bit of a guessing game which ones they are, but a lot of them are also countries in that region. Cameroon, Chad, Niger is in that list. Yemen is there as well as the second for the wide, and Afghanistan. Afghanistan also saw a decrease in the number of terrorist deaths, but very important qualifier there that if you look at the activity of the Taliban in the past year, the group's actually committed more conventional battle deaths against the Afghan government. So the situation in Afghanistan is not necessarily getting better, and this gets to the question of the distinction between state forms of violence and terrorist violence, and something that we shouldn't really forget. When we're looking at the terrorist report, we also need to think about state violence and state-sponsored violence, and that's something that we certainly don't ignore. When you look at the increases in the past year, these are the disturbing trends. Iraq actually increased by 40%. You really need to understand that through the lens of what's going on in the fight against ISIL in 2016. The group was getting more desperate. It was carrying out more suicide attacks in an effort to control its territory. Of course, now, November 2017, we know that the group's on the cusp of military defeat and does not control anywhere near the same amount of territory that it did. So we would expect Iraq in future years to potentially have an improvement. But, of course, the post-conflict settlement will be really critical to the way in which that country progresses. I think one other notable point about the largest increases is if you look at some of these other countries, South Sudan, Turkey, Ethiopia, DRC, all of their terrorist non-state actor violence is actually related to political separatism or political issues, not the Islamist-inspired, jihadist-inspired terrorism that we've seen in other parts of the world. So again, it's suggestive of this new phase in terrorist activity, going more back to the more traditional forms of non-state actor violence that perhaps we might be used to in terrorism studies. Just very quickly touch on some of the trends, and this is a chart showing battle deaths and deaths from terrorism. The red line is deaths from terrorism. The sort of shaded chart there above it is the battlefield deaths that we've seen since 1985. And what you can see there is a new trend, the use of terrorist tactics within the context of conflicts. And we've seen a very strong correlation between terrorism deaths and battlefield deaths. And that's something that is slightly new. And it does remind us about the way in which terrorism is used as a tactic in conflict. This chart shows the four major groups, and again, very concentrated. 4 groups that have committed the great majority of the violence in the past 17 years. ISIL, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram. The 3 other groups, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, the Taliban, have seen improvements, falls in the levels of terrorism that they've committed. ISIL has gone up, but of course, as we've just stated, the group's on the cusp of military defeat. I think that's fundamentally going to undermine its ability to actually carry out more terrorist attacks. It doesn't mean the ideology is defeated. A lot of very important points were made by Ramona on that fact. So we have to look at the actual grievances that underpin a lot of the violence that the group's carried out. And I think it's worth remembering that it's very unlikely that the group would have been able to capture the territory that it did capture without the support of marginalised Sunni populations in both Syria and Iraq. It did require that local support. So I think that's something that we need to remind ourselves of when we think of the post-conflict settlement. The way in which the sectarian divides in that country are resolved are going to be really critical for building peace in the long run. So I'm just going to touch on Europe because, and you know, we're sitting in Europe, and of course the trends in Europe have been disturbing in the past year. I think the first thing I want to just highlight is if you look at all terrorism in Europe back to 1970, it's a region that's not unused to terrorist activity. I think it's important to remind ourselves of. If you look at the post-1970 period, separatism was a very large form of violence. ETA and the IRA committed a very significant proportion of deaths. You had also some other, perhaps in retrospect, random violent events. Yes, Sikh extremist attack or blow up a plane in 1985. But since 2011, we have seen a slight increase, and the last year there has been a notable increase. Just to disaggregate that for a moment, there's been about 10,000 people killed in Europe, in the OECD, I should say, in the last 46 years, and 31% of that is Al-Qaeda, and that's purely by virtue of September 11, which is the most devastating terrorist attack in history. So one large attack can actually suddenly upset the trends. Secondly, you see Irish separatists, mostly the IRA, committing about 19% of the attacks or deaths, and you then see ISIL, which is about 4.7%. So as terrifying as the ISIL trend has been, I think we also need to contextualize the threat. It's 4.7% of the total deaths in the last 46 years. The group has actually not been that deadly compared to a lot of other groups that we've seen, especially here in Europe. Just going to focus in on the trend a little bit and just look at the fact that it's increased in the last 3 years. This has been a very concerning trend. I think if you look at the first half of 2017, which is not the focus of the report, but we can compile some of the statistics on this, there has been a slight improvement. There's been about 82 deaths, and that's obviously terrible and far too much, but it is less than the 265 odd that we saw in 2016, and the year's almost finished. We've also seen fewer attacks. So that is suggestive of the fact that we are seeing an improvement. And one thing that the report did this year is actually try and assess the effectiveness of counterterrorism and policing services. And we found that if you go back to 2015, about 19% of all the attacks were interdicted or intercepted by the security services that were successfully foiled. That actually increased to 34% in the last year. So the security services are becoming more effective at stopping these attacks before they occur. Unfortunately, what that is related to is a change in tactics. Ramona also touched on this. A lot of the really sophisticated attacks involving bombings, kidnappings, involving a large number of people, those attacks are actually very difficult to carry out, and they're easier for security services to interdict. They are more deadly, however. So if you can get these attacks going for a terrorist group, it's more effective for them. But that's why there's been this shift towards lone actor attacks and to much more simple attacks involving knives, cars and trucks, which unfortunately, some of which have been quite devastating. So I just touched on that. We've seen this phenomenon of the lone actor attack really quite dramatically increase, and again, I think coming to the end of June 2017, I think we will see an improvement, hopefully by the end of this year, in terms of the number of attacks and fatalities. And I think we also need to remember that you only need a small number of attacks that are very effective to really significantly increase the total number of fatalities. The spike in 2016 was mainly because of the Orlando attacks and a handful of other quite significant attacks like the Nice attack. So why are people committing these acts, and what is going on? Well, in the past 3 years, the fact is that the great majority of these lone actor attacks have been ISIL directed or ISIL inspired. And this is something that has been quite concerning and certainly a disturbing trend. One thing to note, however, is that if you look at ISIL inspired attacks, the link between the lone actor and the group itself is often quite tenuous, and that's important to highlight. The directed attacks are the ones that tend to be more deadly, like the Bataclan attack, and those are the ones that the security services in particular are becoming more effective at interdicting. Let's take a longer run view of the motivations and just to contextualize the lone actor threat in the OECD. The really important thing to note is that if you look at the US and the United States as the two countries the US and the United Kingdom as the two countries that have suffered significant lone actor attacks, a very significant proportion of them have been inspired by non-Islamist or non-jihadi forms of terrorist activity. They've either been around individual issues, we've seen a lot of white supremacism, we've seen political violence, political separatism. This is just important to remind ourselves, if we're going to have a holistic counterterrorism policy, we need to actually think of the other types of terrorist activity as well. And I was saying this in London last night. If you looked at the 2016 deaths that occurred in the country last year, there were about 9 deaths, sadly, tragically. 6 of the 9 were actually related to Irish separatists. which has not garnered much media attention, and 2 have been related to Islamist or jihadi-inspired terrorists, and 1 was a neo-Nazi, the man that killed the MP Joe Cox. So we need to look at some of the other forms of violence and the other motivations behind terrorism to get a much broader, bigger picture view. One of the really critical facts and findings from the report that we have emphasised in previous years, and we certainly emphasise this year as well, is that if you look at all the terrorist attacks that have occurred in the past 45, 50 odd years, 99% of them have happened in the context of armed conflict, so in the confines of, or when there's already conflicts going on, or in the context of serious political violence, political terror, breaches of human rights. And this is unfortunately why the human rights narrative is important, because we know that human rights and conflict actually can be a fundamental driver of a lot of the grievances that give rise to terrorist activity. If you look at how terrorist groups end, I'm just going to very quickly touch on this. There's been an analysis done by some terrorist scholars that we've cited in the report, and thanks to academics like Professor Herrera, we can do this because there's been some fantastic research done. This particular piece of research looks at more than 500 terrorist groups over the last 40 odd years and how they've ended. And what that research has shown is that the majority of the groups that have successfully ended have entered politics, or there's been some conciliatory process, not dissimilar to the peace agreement that we saw FARC enter into with the Colombian government earlier this year. So that conciliatory tactic is really the critical thing. For groups like ISIL, where there's maximalist claims and there's no obvious negotiable strategy, that doesn't, I think, really apply. But it's important to note that military or police defeats are fairly rare. They don't happen that often. Usually what happens is that the group splinters into another permutation, which is sometimes more violent, more extreme, or it splinters off into a number of other smaller groups. So why do individuals radicalise? I'm just going to very quickly touch on this and then finish my comments. I think it's just important to make a distinction here between the conditions that give rise to extremism in the West, broadly speaking, and the conditions that give rise to extremism, especially in developing settings. I think in counterterrorism discourse and a lot of our day-to-day conversations, this is a source of serious confusion. I think when you look at the reasons why individuals radicalise, what we see from the research is that there are multiple paths to radicalisation. And a lot of the socio-economic factors or explainers are not that powerful in explaining why people commit forms of extremism. We see very high levels of education and very low levels of education. We see high levels of religious knowledge and low levels of religious knowledge. We see relative forms of inclusion and relative forms of exclusion. So this is very confusing, and if we just took a simple socio-economic lens and just picked out the population cohorts that we think are most vulnerable, there would be a lot more terrorists. The fact of the matter is a lot of these disadvantaged cohorts are less than 1% of them actually commit terrorist acts. So I think that's important to remember, and when we look at the individual drivers of terrorist activity, what is a powerful explainer is this notion of profound group experiences in either gang situations, family contexts, prisons has been an area, and I think that's where we need to focus. And it's important to point out, because I think a lot of the generalizable statements about why people are radicalized are actually quite unhelpful to our discourse around why terrorism actually occurs. So I'm just going to conclude my comments. I think the first thing to note is that we are at a turning point, and just to reaffirm that. There is a lot of uncertainty about what happens next. I think the current risks and the future of Iraq and Syria are really quite critical. That's where the majority of the world's terrorism has happened in the last 10 years. That's where it's emanated from. It will need the grievances that gave rise to that terrorism are arguably still there, and we need to actually develop real peace-building approaches to addressing a lot of those challenges. There are some future risks and tactical and strategic risks, I think, from a security point of view. The fact is that you have many foreign fighters leaving Iraq and Syria. Many of them are stateless, and there is the risk that some of these fighters travel not only back to Western Europe, but also to other pockets of the world where there are, I guess, Muslim populations who are marginalized. And we can think of various parts of Southeast Asia. We can think of Dagestan region in Russia. We can think of the Xinjiang region in China. There's also the Philippines, of course, where we saw a very large amount of terrorism. So there is a possibility that we could see a spread, and that's a concerning trend. About 30 to 50% of the 5,000 foreign fighters that traveled from Western Europe have returned back to their home countries. And I think reintegration strategies will be really important for addressing the reasons why they went in the first place, and also reintegrating them into society. That will be critical. And I think we just need to remember the contextual driver's point that 99% of terrorism happens in the context of conflict and in the context of human rights breaches. That leads us to a very clear conclusion that we need to actually focus on the broader conditions that give rise to conflict. We need to look at peace building, we need to look at positive peace, and the factors that really underlie a lot of the grievances. So I'm going to conclude my comments there, and I know that there's probably a lot of Q&A for our other panelists, and just reiterate my thanks for everyone to come along, and well done for staying up so late and going through all these PowerPoint slides with us. Thank you very much.